Welcome to the deep dive. If you're looking to get up to speed quickly but thoroughly, you're in the right place.
Yeah, we cut through the noise.
Today, we're tackling the China-Vietnam relationship. It's always been complex, but recent U.S. trade actions are really shaking things up.
Absolutely. And we've got some great material to work with. News from the Standard in Hong Kong, Reuters, via Reddit, actually, which is interesting. A Wikipedia entry for that historical grounding, a Carnegie Endowment report looking at the Belt and Road Initiative in the region,
Right.
and a Vietnam briefing piece analyzing these new U.S. tariffs.
Okay, so our mission today, unpack the latest between China and Vietnam, figure out what's driving these changes, and, explore the fallout, especially with these U.S. trade moves looming large.
Let's jump in. First up, Xi Jinping was just in Hanoi.
Yeah, literally yesterday, April 14th, 2025. The timing feels significant.
It really is. I mean, China's facing those huge 145% U.S. duties.
Wow.
And Vietnam's looking down the barrel of potential 46% tariffs come July if nothing changes. So, yeah, the timing is very pointed.
And Xi didn't mince words, did he? The Standard mentioned his article in Vietnam's party newspaper, Nhan Den.
Right. He basically said, there are no winners in trade wars and tariff wars. Pretty direct, even without naming names.
It's a strong signal, and apparently they signed a bunch of deals.
Yeah, dozens of cooperation agreements is the word. Focus seems to be on supply chains, railway links, that sort of thing.
Though not much detail on the money side. Right?
No. The specifics, financial commitments, that's all under wraps for now. But there was also a separate aviation deal signed just before the main meetings.
So on one side, they're cozying up stronger ties with China. But at the same time, Washington's breathing down their neck. Vietnam's tightening controls, aren't they?
They are. The Standard piece points this out. They're trying to make sure goods labeled made in Vietnam for the U.S. market actually have significant value added there.
To avoid being seen as just a backdoor for Chinese stuff trying to dodge U.S. tariffs. Makes sense.
Exactly. And that memorandum between the Trade Promotion Councils, China's CCPIT, and Vietnam's VCCI.
The ones who issue the origin certificate.
Right. That signals they're trying to manage this to facilitate legitimate trade, but also address those U.S. concerns about, circumvention.
It puts Vietnam in such a tricky spot. They're this major assembly hub, getting most imports from China, but their biggest customer is the U.S. Electronics, shoes, clothes.
And the numbers really show it. First quarter of 2025, roughly $30 billion from China, $31.4 billion out to the U.S. Those flows are tightly linked.
That's incredible.
And this ties into what people were saying on Reddit, speculation about Vietnam, maybe hoping for a U.S. deal, but also really wanting to avoid getting too locked into China's orbit.
Like that user comment, Vietnam doesn't want to be dependent on China, but the U.S. is pushing them away.
Yeah, that sums up the dilemma pretty well. Official statements talk cooperation, but underneath you sense this real pragmatism from Vietnam, hedging their bets.
It's a classic tightrope walk. Okay, so that's a now. But this relationship has deep roots, doesn't it? We need that historical context.
Definitely. How did these two socialist states get here? The Wikipedia entry gives a good overview. It's a long, long history. Millennia, really.
Right. With northern Vietnam under Chinese influence, even direct rule for huge stretches of time.
Centuries of imperial control, then Vietnamese pushback, like after Bach in 938 A.D., it wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
Not at all. Then fast forward to the Cold War, things shift again.
Yeah, Communist China supporting Communist North Vietnam against the U.S. and its ally, South Vietnam, which is backed by Taiwan, the ROC.
So an alliance based on ideology for a while.
For a time. But that fell apart pretty spectacularly after Vietnam reunified in 75.
Cambodia, right. Vietnam going in to oust the Khmer Rouge.
Exactly. China backed the Khmer Rouge, saw Vietnam's move as expansionist, trying to dominate Indochina.
While Vietnam just wanted friendly neighbors on its border.
A fundamental clash of interests. It led straight to the Sino-Vietnamese War in 79, border clashes dragging on until 1990. Plus, tensions over ethnic Chinese in Vietnam.
It's fascinating how that fear of dependence, the one we saw on Reddit, echoes through their history.
It really does. Shared ideology clearly wasn't enough when national interests diverged so sharply.
But things did thaw eventually. Wikipedia mentions normalization in 1991.
Right, after the Soviet Union collapsed and Vietnam pulled out of Cambodia. Since then, they've worked on improving ties, especially economic ones.
Despite those ongoing South China Sea disputes, which are always simmering.
Always there. But the economic side has boomed. That Xinhua interview with Deputy PM Sun, he called Vietnam China's biggest ASEAN trade partner fourth biggest globally.
That's massive. And infrastructure is key here. Railways came up earlier.
Yeah, the Carnegie Report on the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, gives more detail.
China's huge global infrastructure plan.
Exactly. In Vietnam, there's the Lao Cai Hanoi Haiphong line, meant to start construction this year. Plus, planning underway for 2 other standard gauge lines connecting to the coast and the border, potentially big connectivity boosters.
And some older projects like that Hanoi railway line and a power station got sort of grandfathered into the BRI framework.
Yeah, the Catlin Han line and Ventan power plant predate BRI's official launch in 2013, but Carnegie notes they're now seen as part of it.
So Vietnam's officially on board with BRI, but cautiously.
Seems that way. Deputy PM Sun mentioned the railway progress positively, but the Carnegie report stresses Vietnam wants high-quality, low-risk projects.
Aligning with their own development plans, like 2 corridors, 1 belt.
Right, and international standards. They're not just taking anything China offers. They seem to be learning from other countries' experiences, trying to engage on their own terms.
Makes sense. What are the views inside Vietnam on BRI? Carnegie looked at that.
It did. It's mixed. Academics, media, some see the potential upside. Better infrastructure, local revenue, maybe easing political friction.
Hedging their bets a bit.
Sort of.
Yeah.
And maybe the terms seem less strict than some other international loans. The scale isn't always enormous.
Yeah.
Those are seen as pluses by some.
But there are definite worries, too.
Oh, yeah. Concerns about slow progress, cost ballooning, lack of transparency in bidding.
The usual BRI criticisms we hear elsewhere.
Pretty much. Debt trap risks, potential political leverage for China, infrastructure maybe having dual-use military potential down the line.
And social environmental impacts.
Also mentioned, environmental worries about power plants, labor safety issues, China potentially gaining too much control over local assets.
So Vietnam's pushing back, asking for more.
They are. Carnegie says they want more transparency, genuine win-win outcomes, greener projects, more balanced trade, tech transfer, higher value investment.
Specific areas, maybe.
Critical minerals and better border links were mentioned as priorities for Vietnam.
So it's a balancing act again. Seeking benefits, wary of risks.
Okay, let's pivot to those U.S. tariffs, that Vietnam briefing analysis. What's the headline?
The big one. A new 46% reciprocal tariff on all Vietnamese imports to the U.S., effective April 9th, 2025.
46%
No,
across the
yeah.
board. That's huge. What's the U.S. reasoning?
They're framing it based on the trade surplus. The administration claims Vietnam is charging the U.S. 90% based on that surplus figure, so 46% is presented as a sort of discounted reciprocal rate.
Wow, that could absolutely hammer Vietnam's economy. Textiles, footwear, furniture, these sectors rely heavily on the U.S., don't they?
Massively. Vietnam briefing highlights those specifically. Decades of growth there. A 46% tariff could just crush margins, kill orders, cost jobs, a lot of jobs.
And diversifying away from the U.S. market, that's not easy, is it?
Extremely difficult. Other markets like Europe or elsewhere in Asia are competitive, complex logistically, and frankly, no other single market matches the U.S. scale for these goods.
It feels punitive. Could it be like a negotiation tactic? That's definitely a possibility the analysis raises. Using this immense pressure to force Vietnam's hand, to cut the surplus, buy more U.S. stuff, maybe agricultural goods or energy. High-stakes poker, really.
It really is, and this isn't the only measure, right? Steel and aluminum.
Correct. The Vietnam briefing piece reminds us those tariffs were reinstated 25% on steel, and aluminum bumped up to 25%.
Vietnam was already subject to some of those.
Yeah, the earlier rounds. So steel might not change things dramatically, maybe levels the field slightly, but aluminum, smaller volumes, more vulnerable to that hike.
And the U.S. auto tariff.
25%. Minimal direct impact on Vietnam, apparently. They just don't export many cars to the U.S. right now.
But the overall signal is clear. The U.S. is getting tough on trade imbalances, and Vietnam's in the crosshairs.
Absolutely. And Vietnam briefing flags the risk of more tariffs, especially with the U.S. designating Vietnam a non-market economy.
Plus that whole issue of Chinese goods maybe being rerouted through Vietnam.
That adds another layer of risk, yeah. If the U.S. suspects that's happening to dodge their China tariffs, Vietnam could face even more scrutiny.
And what about bigger trade deals?
Certainly reigns there. With the current U.S. administration, rejoining CPTPP seems unlikely. And the future of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is pretty cloudy too.
But there's maybe a glimmer of hope. Vietnam's talking to the U.S.
Seems so. Vietnam briefing mentions Vietnam's potential willingness to buy more U.S. goods, especially agricultural products. And there are ongoing talks, high-level visits. like that recent delegation to Washington.
So they're actively trying to find a path through this.
Definitely trying to negotiate, mitigate the damage.
Okay, so how does Vietnam itself frame all this, especially the China relationship right now? That Xinhua interview with Deputy PM Bui Thon Sen sounds key.
It gives a very official positive spin. He described the China relationship as seeing robust, comprehensive, and significant development. Strong words.
Emphasizing the positive trajectory. He mentioned Xi's visit being important, following their own leader to Lam's visit to China last year.
Yes, highlighting the strategic significance, the expected long-term impact. It's presented as building momentum.
And the goals of Xi's visit, what did Sun emphasize?
Strengthening high-level communication, building political trust, sharing governance tips, and basically charting a stable course together in these uncertain times. Very much about political and strategic alignment.
And the practical cooperation areas, railways again.
Railways, yes. Also agricultural trade, science and tech, education, and the digital and green economies. Sectors where they see mutual gains.
And they're trying to boost people-to-people ties, too, that year of exchanges.
Right, the 2025 Vietnam-China Year of People-to-People Exchanges. Sun highlighted its role in building friendship and public support for the relationship.
Interesting. What about the South China Sea? Always the elephant in the room.
He touched on it. Said both sides are committed to resolving things through frank, sincere talks based on existing agreements, all aimed at regional peace and stability.
So managing the disputes without derailing the whole relationship.
That's the message. Keep the contentious stuff contained, focus on the positives.
So Sun laid out these 4 pillars: political trust, economic infrastructure links like railways, people-to-people stuff, and managing the sea disputes effectively.
Pretty much summarized their official positive view. He wrapped up expressing confidence Xi's visit was a resounding success and a new milestone.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, what's the big picture?
It's incredibly intricate, isn't it? You've got China and Vietnam strengthening ties, partly maybe driven by this U.S. pressure.
Building on that long, complicated history.
Exactly. And expanding economic cooperation, BRI included, but with Vietnam trying to stay cautious.
All while navigating these potentially massive U.S. tariffs and the whole geopolitical chess game.
It's really dynamic. You see history, economics, U.S. policy, regional strategy, all interacting.
Vietnam's caught in the middle, trying to balance these huge forces.
A strategic balancing act, definitely. Leveraging ties with both China and the U.S., wary of over-reliance on either. The history adds that extra layer of complexity, even with shared ideology and economic links.
So thinking ahead, here's something for our listeners to chew on. Given that long history, cooperation, conflict, everything in between, and now these intense pressures from the U.S., what's the biggest long-term challenge for China and Vietnam?
That's a tough one.
And maybe more importantly, how could they actually navigate that challenge for mutual benefit in this messy global picture? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.